Good evening. I'm Gavin Cleesby, the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm happy to welcome you and wish you all a Happy New Year. For anyone who might be visiting the Mass Historical Society for the first time, we are an independent nonprofit organization. We maintain an amazing research library with a great collection of material. We hold close to 14 million manuscript pages in our collection, which include the papers of 3 of the first 6 U.S. presidents. We also host a wide variety of programs, and we have a great amount of stuff coming up. All of our programs are open to the public and available either for free or at a very low cost. But we're only able to host programs like this thanks to the support of our members and donors. So if you enjoy our program, and I hope you do, I hope you'll come back for other programs, and I hope that you'll consider supporting MHS through a membership donation or another contribution. This evening, we're happy to welcome Peter Shinkle back to MHS. Mr. Shinkle last spoke here in March of 2019 on his book, Ike's Mystery Man, which explored the influence of Robert Cutler, President Eisenhower's national security advisor, who also happened to be Mr. Shinkle's great uncle. This evening, he'll be discussing his new book, Uniting America, How FDR and Henry Stimson Brought Democrats and Republicans Together to Win World War II. This explores something that seems hard to imagine today, which is a truly bipartisan alliance. In this case, it was a delicately crafted alliance that helped America unify and defeat the Axis powers in World War II. So without further ado, please welcome our speaker this evening.
Good evening. Thank you, Gavin. It's a tremendous honor to be here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I had the pleasure of conducting research here for my previous work about Bostonian Robert Cutler, and I have great respect and appreciation for the Society, its collections, and its staff. I'm going to talk to you this evening about my book, which is about America's bipartisan leadership during World War II. But I'd like to begin with a few thoughts about political partisanship and the early days of our nation. When the founders wrote the Constitution in 1787, the idea of a political party was practically non-existent. The Constitution gives no role and no rights to political parties per se. The founders instead envisioned a republic of individuals forming a government to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The first president, George Washington, disdained the 2 nascent parties of his day, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. In September 1796, toward the end of his second term, Washington made his farewell address, announcing that he would not seek a third term. He also issued a blistering condemnation of partisanship, or what he called in the parlance of the day, the spirit of party. He warned that partisanship makes the country vulnerable to corruption and foreign influence. He also said it causes the spread of false information. Washington didn't argue there should be absolutely no partisanship. In fact, he said, in moderate amounts, it could be beneficial. But he urged Americans to restrain partisanship. He warned that it could cause, quote, the chief of some prevailing faction to rise to power on the ruins of public liberty. He warned that partisanship, quote, agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, and foments occasionally riot and insurrection. How prophetic. 220 years after Washington issued his dire warning, Donald Trump unleashed his particular brand of partisanship on American politics. He fanned the flames of racial animosity by making repeated attacks on the nation's first black president, and by saying Mexico was sending rapists to America. He praised dictators like Russia's Vladimir Putin. Trump went on to spread countless lies that the Democrats stole the 2020 election from him. In an effort to seize power from his rightfully elected successor, he incited the violent insurrection that struck the nation's capital on January 6, 2021. More recently, he broke bread with avowed anti-Semites. Finally, he suggested terminating the United States Constitution. All of this was fodder for those who say he is a fascist. If Trump had succeeded in his coup attempt in January 2021, he would have been precisely the person that George Washington was warning us about when he said that partisanship would lead to the chief of some prevailing faction rising to power on the ruins of public liberty. Now, my talk today is not a diatribe against Donald Trump. It is a talk about history. My book, Uniting America, tells the story of how once upon a time, our country benefited tremendously from having leaders who were far less partisan. In fact, they were leaders who rose above partisanship to do the right thing for the country. In contrast with today's politics, this may sound like a fairy tale or a legend from back in the mists of time, but it is all factual, and it was not that long ago. Uniting America is the story of how, at a time of intense political division, prominent Republicans broke with their party and decided they must support a Democratic president to keep America safe and preserve democracy. The result of this bipartisan alliance was one of America's greatest achievements, the defeat of fascism in World War II. At the center of the alliance were these two men, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Henry Stimson. Here they are meeting at Springwood, Roosevelt's estate in Hyde Park, New York, on January 9, 1933. At this time, FDR was still governor of New York, preparing to become president after defeating Republican Herbert Hoover in the presidential election 2 months earlier. Stimson was the Republican Secretary of State to President Hoover. FDR invited Stimson to Hyde Park to discuss world events. Stimson was almost 15 years older than FDR. Though they weren't opposing parties, they had affinities. Both were lawyers, had spent years in New York politics, and were great admirers of Republican President Theodore Roosevelt, FDR's cousin. In fact, Stimson had become close to TR and had served as United States Attorney in New York, bringing significant cases in TR's battle against the trusts. Stimson also had served as Secretary of War under TR's successor, Republican President William H. Taft. Stimson ran in 1910 for New York governor, and even though he had vigorous support from TR, he lost. He never ran for office again. He returned to a highly successful career with his Wall Street firm, Winthrop Stimson. He remained a respected public figure in the Republican Party. After he became Secretary of State under Hoover, Stimson publicly criticized FDR. But FDR looked past those attacks. He saw something else in Stimson, a rigorous honesty. He told their mutual friend, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, that Stimson, quote, didn't play politics. At the time of this meeting, the Nazis were not yet in power. This is 2 months before the Reichstag fire that Hitler used to seize power. Stimson had one major objective in this meeting: to convince FDR to stand by Stimson's policy on Manchuria. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931. Stimson said the United States would refuse to recognize this seizure of another country's territory. This became known as the Stimson Doctrine. FDR agreed to embrace Stimson's policy, and he announced he would do so a week later. Their January 1933 meeting was the start of a robust private dialogue the two men would have over the next few years, and it often focused on the threat to freedom around the world. In late 1934, Stimson sent FDR an essay by British liberal historian Ramsay Muir calling for a defense of liberal democracies. Here's how Muir put it: "The cause of liberty is not dead, though it is momentarily obscured. And if those who love liberty and appreciate the magnitude and profundity of the choice which lies before humanity are at this moment in all countries few, disheartened, and disorganized, that is no justification for relaxing their efforts." FDR sent a handwritten note to Stimson saying he read the essay after going to bed one night and read it a second time the next night. "Thank you for sending it to me," the president wrote. "It is a splendid expression of faith." As far as I know, this correspondence between Stimson and FDR has never been revealed before my book's publication. I believe, however, that is a key to understanding the relationship between the two men. The start of World War II lay 5 years in the future, but here, in a quiet personal exchange of letters, the two men forged a bond based on a shared reverence for democracy and a profound moral, almost religious, imperative to defend it. The threat of war from the rise of fascism soared in the mid-1930s. Meanwhile, isolationists had risen to power in Washington. Both parties had strong isolationists in Congress demanding that the United States stay out of foreign wars. In 1936, they passed the Neutrality Act, which meant that if a war broke out, the United States could not send aid to either side in the conflict. In other words, if a democratic ally like France were to be attacked by a fascist dictator, the United States, by law, could not send aid to the French. Despite his concerns about defending democracies, FDR chose not to fight the isolationists. It would cost him too much political capital. An election was coming in the fall of 1936. He signed the act into law, and the next year, he signed an expansion of it. Stimson, who believed the United States must take action to defend democracy, opposed the act and repeatedly called publicly for its repeal. He testified in Congress in March of 1939 that the act's impact on U.S. foreign policy was like, quote, playing poker with your hand open on the table while the other hands are concealed. But FDR and Congress refused to repeal the Neutrality Act. On September 1, 1939, 6 months after Stimson gave that testimony, the Nazis invaded Poland. Poland's treaty allies, Great Britain and France, declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. The Neutrality Act prevented the United States from sending any aid to Britain and France. Stimson again called for the repeal of the Neutrality Act. He was opposed by Charles Lindbergh, the aviation hero who was leader of the isolationist group America First. Lindbergh called for staying out of the war and negotiating for peace with Hitler. This time, FDR sided with Stimson on the Neutrality Act. In an emergency speech before both chambers of Congress, FDR said, "I regret that Congress passed that act. I regret equally that I signed that act." Nazi forces quickly defeated Poland and threatened Britain and France. Prodded by FDR and Stimson, Congress at last took action. With significant bipartisan support, Congress repealed most of the Neutrality Act in early November. The United States immediately began sending arms to Britain. This defeat of the Neutrality Act was a momentous event, clearing the way for America to support its allies. Stimson played a crucial role in winning Republican support in Congress. This demonstrated the power of bipartisanship to defeat isolationism, a turning point in American politics. This was not lost on Frank Knox, who had been the 1936 vice presidential nominee of the Republican Party. He was a severe critic of FDR's New Deal. Knox had been among those Republicans who charged the New Deal was destroying free enterprise and condemned FDR as a socialist. Remember, the Republicans attacked Social Security as a socialist program. They hated FDR for, among other things, a New Deal law that protected the rights of labor unions to organize. But Knox placed above all his belief that America must help the Allies fight Hitler. Knox was publisher of the powerful Chicago Daily News, and in its pages he ran editorials calling for FDR to create a bipartisan cabinet to wage this critical war. In December 1939, Knox went to Washington and met secretly with FDR to discuss the idea of a bipartisan cabinet. Knox told FDR he wanted to be Secretary of the Navy. They also discussed the need for a second Republican to join the cabinet so it would not look like a one-off, but a Republican movement. There was no mention of Stimson. He was at this time 72 years old and likely considered too old by FDR and Knox. But FDR quickly put the idea on hold out of concern that appointing Republicans to his cabinet at this point would look like political maneuvering, not simply patriotism in a time of crisis. 5 months went by. Then, on May 10, 1940, the Nazis invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. In Britain, Churchill formed what he called his National Coalition government, with broad support from the Conservative, Labour, and Liberal parties. On May 13, Parliament voted in support of Churchill's premiership 381-0. This was proof positive, which FDR could not have missed, that competing parties would unite to defeat fascism. In the following weeks, a private flotilla evacuated Allied soldiers from Dunkirk. The Nazi war machine approached Paris, and the French announced their intention to surrender. On June 18, Stimson delivered a national radio address calling for America to begin conscription to create an army, send weapons to France and England, and prepare for war with Germany. These positions went well beyond anything FDR had said publicly about the war. At a time when millions of Americans still felt bitterly about World War I and opposed sending young American men to war, Stimson boldly made the case that war was once again necessary. The next day, June 19, FDR called Stimson and asked him to join his cabinet as Secretary of War. He also invited Knox to be Secretary of the Navy. They accepted, and the next day the White House announced their appointments as actions necessary for national security and national defense. Republicans immediately called Stimson and Knox traitors and said they were acting against the Republican Party. Party leaders threatened to write them out of the party. The GOP itself made it clear that it was not entering any alliance with FDR. Some Republicans even accused Stimson and Knox of endangering American democracy by undermining the two-party system. Here you see Stimson with FDR on the day the Senate confirmed his appointment. And here Knox is being sworn in by Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter at Wright as FDR looks on. The two new Republican cabinet secretaries immediately set about trying to strengthen the U.S. military and aid the British and other allies. This is a political cartoon from the Washington Evening Star that captures the challenge that the new bipartisan alliance faced. FDR, joined by the Republican Stimson on the right and Knox on the left, are a ragtag marching band trying to rally American forces. In the foreground lies the national defense, represented by a broken-down wagon. The U.S. military was tiny compared to the mighty forces of Germany and Japan. In 1939, the U.S. Army ranked 19th largest in the world, just behind Portugal's. Germany could field an army of about 2 million men, while the U.S. Army could put only about 15,000 men in the field. In the cartoon's background are Republicans, many of them isolationists, booing. They include Tom Dewey, there in the center, then a leading presidential candidate. FDR and his Republican allies were soon rewarded for their bold move. Polling showed that a significant majority of Americans in both political parties supported the appointments. The appointments came just days before the Republican convention of June 1940 in Philadelphia, and they threw the party into turmoil. Heading into the convention, the leading candidates were isolationists, including particularly Senator Robert Taft of Ohio. But after FDR's appointments of Stimson and Knox, the GOP shifted directions and brushed Taft and Dewey aside. The winner instead was a dark horse candidate whose war policy was closer to FDR's. That was this man, Wendell Willkie. Here, riding in a parade on August 17, 1940, This was the day he formally accepted the Republican nomination in his hometown of Elwood, Indiana. Willkie, in fact, was a friend of Stimson's. And at times, he had turned to Stimson for legal advice. After Willkie was nominated, Stimson secretly urged him not to attack FDR over a bill in Congress to conscript millions of American men into the Army. This was a bipartisan bill sponsored by a friend of Stimson's, Republican Representative Henry Wadsworth of New York. Stimson and Army General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, Army General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, believed it was absolutely critical to rapidly increase the size of the Army. The numbers I related a moment would make it clear that why it was important to do so. So Stimson asked Willkie not to criticize the conscription bill and turn it into a political football which might cause it to die in Congress. Willkie secretly agreed. The campaign battle continued on other fronts, though. FDR was an astute strategist, and he had a great eye for political optics. On the very same day that Willkie was accepting the nomination, FDR arranged for Stimson to travel with him to review soldiers and training exercises in upstate New York. Here you see FDR, Stimson, and Democratic New York Governor Herbert Lehman watching the training exercises from a presidential car. FDR was parading his Republican alliance for all to see. Stimson immediately began working closely with General Marshall. Here you see the two men. Marshall prided himself on his own nonpartisan approach to military duty. He once remarked dryly, "I have never voted. My father was a Democrat, my mother was a Republican, and I am an Episcopalian." Marshall's nonpartisan philosophy matched Stimson's perfectly, and the two men built a close bond. Stimson's and Marshall's united front swayed Congress. The conscription bill passed in September 1940 with bipartisan support. The conscription bill called for 16 million American men to register for the draft, and ultimately 10 million men would be conscripted. Here on October 29, 1940, Stimson, blindfolded at right, draws the first draft number from a large bowl as FDR looks on at the left. This is FDR leaning into his bipartisan alliance to defeat fascism. He could have put the draft number drawing off until after the election, but instead he made a bipartisan political pageant of it. A week later, FDR won the election, defeating Willkie. Stimson immediately saw Willkie could be a huge benefit to the Republican alliance with FDR, and he sought to bring Willkie into the alliance. Stimson wrote his old friend a letter thanking him for his forbearance on the issue of conscription, and he arranged for Willkie to meet with FDR. In December 1940, FDR unveiled the Lend-Lease program to rapidly increase military spending and permit the U.S. military to send arms to the Allies as they believed was necessary. He said Lend-Lease would make America the arsenal of democracy. But isolationism remained a powerful force. America First and isolationists in Congress bitterly attacked FDR and demanded that the United States stay out of the war. The passage of Lend-Lease was no sure thing. Republicans charged Lend-Lease's vast budget would be wasteful. They also complained that it would give the military the power to send weapons overseas without congressional approval. In January 1941, Stimson invited Willkie out to his estate on Long Island and tried to convince him to support Lend-Lease. The very next day, Willkie announced his support for Lend-Lease publicly. Willkie even borrowed a phrase from Stimson. He said, "The goal of U.S. defense is not to keep America out of the war, but to keep the war out of America." Over the next 2 months, Stimson, Knox, and Willkie led the way in testifying for the administration and Congress to support Lend-Lease. This Washington Evening Star cartoon depicts how heavily FDR relied on his Republican allies. Stimson, Knox, and Wilkie are in a trench defending the White House in the foreground. In the background, FDR calls out, "Let me know, boys, when the time has come for the Democrats to get into action." Ultimately, the Lend-Lease bill passed in March of 1941 with strong bipartisan backing, including a vote of 67-9 in the Senate. Now, that is how the bipartisan alliance was forged and took its first crucial steps to defending America from fascism. I'd like to discuss just a few examples of how the alliance worked to unite the country domestically and to solve the military challenges posed by the war. As the conscription debate heated up in 1940, Stimson rejected a push by civil rights activists to end the segregation of soldiers in the U.S. Army. He was concerned that if black and white soldiers operated with weapons in the close confines of military duty, there would be violence. This was, after all, an era of lynchings, white supremacy, and rigid racial segregation. Yet Stimson also considered himself an ally of black Americans. He noted he was the descendant of an abolitionist family, and his father fought for the Union in the Civil War. Black leaders, however, refused to accept Stimson's position. In early 1941, civil rights activist A. Philip Randolph called for a march in Washington to demand desegregation of the military and the war industries. Now here you see Randolph with two of his allies, Eleanor Roosevelt and a Republican, New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. Working with them, Randolph arranged for himself and NAACP Executive Secretary Walter White to meet with FDR and Stimson in June 1941 in the White House. LaGuardia was among the top Republicans who joined in support of FDR long before the U.S. entered the war. At the White House meeting, Stimson agreed to a compromise. The federal government would desegregate not the military itself, but all of the war industries. There were giant employers like Ford, GM, and Boeing making tanks, ships, and planes. LaGuardia drafted a presidential order to carry out the plan, and Stimson reconfirmed days later that it must proceed. On June 25, 1941, FDR signed the document as Executive Order 8802. It created the Fair Employment Practice Commission, or FEPC. Its mission was to investigate complaints of discrimination in employment and take steps to redress them. Uniting America, by the way, if I can make a little marketing prod of my book, is the first book I know of to reveal Stimson's important role in creating the FEPC. Many black Americans patriotically supported the war, and the FEPC bolstered hopes that victory over fascism abroad would be paired with victory at home over racism and segregation. Walter White, who you see here, later wrote that, quote, more progress was made by the FEPC toward employment on the basis of ability in the face of racial and religious discrimination than at any other period in American history. The Democratic Party had long been the party of the Confederacy, Jim Crow, and segregation. But the creation of the FEPC put the party on a trajectory to become the party of civil rights. Segregationists would soon rail against the new agency. FEPC rulings requiring desegregation of war industries led to racial violence. Here you see rioting in June 1943 in Detroit, where mobs of white people attacked black people and overturned black drivers' cars, setting them on fire. Nearly 30 people died, almost all of them black. FDR and Stimson sent Army troops into Detroit to quell the rioting. In New York City, tension arose because of anger over the racial violence in Detroit, and other cities. Mayor LaGuardia and Wendell Willkie both delivered public addresses condemning racial violence and appealing for calm. But a riot broke out in Harlem on the night of August 1, 1943. Here you see LaGuardia broadcasting in the early morning hours, urging peace. LaGuardia worked with Walter White in an effort to end the rioting. And by the next morning, the riot was over, but 5 black men were dead. After the Harlem riot of August 1943, there never was another major riot in the United States during the war. The reason for that is unknown. But certainly some credit is owed to Walter White and the 2 Republican allies of FDR, LaGuardia and Willkie. They sought to restore peace and unity, however fractured they might be, at a time when they were most needed. Now I want to bring us back to a very important event, the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The next day, FDR declared war on Japan, and Congress almost unanimously approved that declaration of war. A declaration of war against Germany came 3 days later. My talk tonight suggests the benefits of bipartisanship, but it must be noted that bipartisanship can also fail to secure the blessings of liberty for all of our citizens. Before Pearl Harbor, FDR urged Stimson to investigate the risks of Japanese spies and sabotage. And after the attack, FDR continued to raise the alarm, and Army officers called for removing Japanese Americans from their homes near military facilities. Stimson noted in his diary that removing Japanese Americans from their homes would, quote, put a hole in our constitutional system, close quote. Yet he ultimately approved the idea. FDR signed an executive order on February 20, 1942, authorizing removal of citizens from areas near military installations. And Stimson the next day signed an order authorizing removal of citizens of Japanese descent from designated military zones. Within months, Army officers ordered some 110,000 Japanese Americans to be interned in a string of concentration camps spread across the western states. This was a colossal failure of America's constitutional protections, and most of the administration's internment program was ruled unconstitutional 3 years later by the Supreme Court. To this day, the internment of Japanese Americans remains a stain on American democracy and on the bipartisan wartime alliance. If you're looking for a reason to show that bipartisanship can lead to failures, you don't need to look much further. In the end, bipartisanship is only as good as the policies it embraces. That's why we have constitutional rights, to protect the minority from a misguided majority. My book is not a hagiography. It is an attempt to look at the bipartisan alliance, including all of its blemishes. As the war raged after Pearl Harbor, women rushed to join the military. But there was really no vehicle for them to do so. A Republican U.S. representative from Massachusetts had a solution. Her name was U.S. Representative Edith Nourse Rogers, and in 1925, she became the first woman in Congress from the Northeast. Rogers proposed a bill in Congress to create the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the WACs. With support from both Stimson and FDR, it passed with bipartisan support. Here, Rogers stands with the first graduating class of WACs trainees. That's at a WACs base in Iowa. Though the WACs could not join battle, they opened a new path for women to support the war effort. They also changed perceptions of women's roles in society. As the war effort expanded, Wendell Willkie's alliance with FDR grew. In spring 1942, Willkie asked FDR for support to travel around the globe meeting with American allies. FDR agreed and provided a U.S. Army plane for that purpose. the president announced that Willkie's global tour would show that in America, quote, "we have a unity and we are going all out." With FDR's support, Willkie went to Egypt, China, and other countries, meeting Allied leaders from August to October 1942. Here, Willkie meets with Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin in Moscow at center. This was an astounding expression of bipartisan strength in support of democracy. Imagine for a moment a bipartisan act of this sort today. Could Joe Biden today send his former rival for the presidency, Donald Trump, around the world to show strength of American democracy? Or could Donald Trump have sent his previous rival, Hillary Clinton, on such a trip? I think we can agree the answer is no. Stimson's strategic views, personality, and management style regularly clashed with FDR's. When a meeting began, Stimson liked to dive into the matter at hand, while FDR would begin with friendly chatter and jokes, meandering to the subject. In late 1940, in a private diary entry, Stimson described working with FDR as, quote, "chasing a vagrant beam of sunshine around a vacant room." But by mid-1943, 3 years into their alliance, their bond, built on trust and shared democratic values, was steeled through facing conflict together. FDR rebuffed members of the Democratic National Committee who urged him to dismiss Stimson. He later sent Stimson a handwritten note saying, "You and I are facing a long, hard road, but we both have faith, and that is half the battle." For his part, Stimson noted in his diary in May of 1943 that he told the general about, quote, "my experience with two great executives, Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt." He also noted that he tried to, quote, "combat some of the very stiff prejudice I find everywhere against the president." The strength of their relationship would be critical as Stimson advised FDR on how to deal with his friend and ally, Winston Churchill. Now, Stimson admired Churchill as a political leader in the cause of saving democracy, but he despised Churchill's military strategy. Yet they had to work together. Here you see Stimson and Marshall with Churchill observing Army training exercises in South Carolina in June of 1942. Churchill, at the center, puffs on a cigar. Stimson is at right in a pith helmet. In early 1943, Stimson and Marshall convinced FDR and Churchill that the invasion of France must take place in the spring of 1944. The top British general, Alan Brooke, was expected to lead the invasion. But Churchill continued to voice doubts about the plan. In July of 1943, Stimson traveled to London to meet with Churchill. Churchill told Stimson that if it were up to him, he would not proceed with the invasion, which he saw as highly risky. He worried about the terrible effect of having the English Channel, as he put it, full of corpses of defeated allies. Stimson retorted, "We could never win any battle by talking about corpses." Stimson returned to Washington and promptly delivered a bleak assessment of British leadership to FDR. Stimson said, quote, "The shadows of Dunkirk and Passchendaele still hang too heavily over the imagination of these leaders." Passchendaele was a town in Belgium where World War I battles left tens of thousands dead. Stimson told FDR an American commander, not Brooke, must lead the invasion. FDR immediately agreed and said that he would push the British to make an American the top commander. He quickly raised the matter with Churchill, who assented. FDR ultimately named General Dwight Eisenhower for the job. Here, Ike talks to airborne troops preparing to assault the Nazis in France. The next day, June 6, 1944, the massive D-Day invasion began, and it stunned the Nazi war machine. The next month, at the age of 76, Stimson flew to Europe to witness the work of the U.S. soldiers he had sent into battle. He traveled to France and drove 150 miles in a Jeep across battlefields. Here, he and Eisenhower met with reporters at Eisenhower's field command headquarters in Normandy. Looking to the post-war period, FDR and Stimson believed that to preserve peace and spread democracy after the war, it was essential to create a permanent organization of the United Nations, as the Allies were called at that time. At the same time, Stimson and FDR worried that isolationism would resurge after the war and crush their plan to have the U.S. join a new international peacekeeping organization. But a bipartisan solution to the problem emerged. The Republican vice chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, publicly abandoned his severe isolationism in January 1945. He called for U.S. support of international organizations to prevent war. The next month, FDR appointed Vandenberg to a bipartisan delegation to represent the United States at a meeting in San Francisco to create a permanent UN organization. Here, that delegation meets with FDR in the Oval Office on March 13, 1945. Senator Vandenberg is second from right. A month later, FDR died, and Vice President Harry S. Truman became president. One of Truman's first decisions was that the UN conference must proceed. The delegation went to San Francisco and helped write the UN Charter and Treaty. Senator Vandenberg urged the U.S. Senate to approve it. On July 28, 1945, while the war was still raging in the Pacific, the Senate voted 89-2 to ratify the UN Charter and have the U.S. join the new permanent organization. This was a soaring victory for bipartisanship. It also enshrined the internationalist philosophy of FDR and Henry Stimson, who believed that the United States must commit itself to spreading peace and democracy across the planet. Now, let's go back to April 12, 1945, the day FDR died. Here, Truman is sworn in as president in the White House Cabinet Room. You can see Henry Stimson on the far left of this image. As they filed out of the Cabinet Room, Stimson held back and revealed to Truman that the United States was building a new explosive of almost unbelievable destructive power. This was the atom bomb. Neither Stimson nor FDR had told Vice President Truman about the bomb until that day, even as FDR's health declined. Stimson did not have with Truman the same kind of relationship based on trust and respect that he had with FDR. Stimson wrote in his diary a year earlier, a year earlier, on March 13, 1944, Truman is a nuisance and a pretty untrustworthy man. He talks smoothly, but he acts meanly. Thus, Truman and Stimson faced a tremendous challenge. Would they be able to continue the bipartisan alliance that Stimson began with FDR 5 years earlier? Truman kept Stimson on as Secretary of War, but in making decisions about the bomb, Truman placed much greater reliance upon his Democratic ally, James Byrnes, whom he appointed Secretary of State. Byrnes and Stimson did not agree on a critical issue regarding the decision to drop the bomb. The Democratic president would have to sit in judgment over a dispute, pitting a Democratic ally against his Republican Secretary of War on a critical matter. I'm not going to tell you how bipartisanship faltered in the decision to drop the bomb. You're just going to have to read the book to find out. Now here, Truman and Stimson meet in the Oval Office on August 8. A nuclear weapon was dropped on Nagasaki the next day. The Japanese surrendered days later. Though overshadowed by the use of the bomb, the end of the war was the crowning achievement of the wartime bipartisan alliance. The powerful fascist armies were defeated. Democracy survived. It would even flourish in Germany and Japan. On September 21, 1945, Stimson celebrated his 78th birthday and resigned as Secretary of War. Truman carried forward the bipartisan alliance, placing his own stamp on it. Perhaps most significantly, Truman worked with Vandenberg to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to defend democracy in Europe. When Stimson died in 1950, Truman said, "As a statesman who placed duty to country above party line, he scorned unreasoning abuse heaped upon him when he accepted a post with a national administration not of the political party to which he had given long allegiance." So he leaves a full record. Great as a lawyer, great as a statesman, he was also a patriot, a great American. The bipartisan alliance, led by Roosevelt and Stimson, created an imperative to defend democracy around the world that has become a cornerstone of American foreign policy. Their vision was so powerful that isolationism has never regained its dominance of American and Western political thought. Remarkably, most Americans have no knowledge of this astonishing bipartisan collaboration. When I began this project, I was astonished to find no book had ever been written about it. Why is that? I believe human psychology is such that we tend to remember war makers more than peacemakers, or those who reach a compromise with the other side. Another reason is that political parties raise money by pointing out how evil the other side is, not how well things worked when the two sides compromised to achieve a common goal. I think we as a society have much to learn from the wartime bipartisan alliance. The greatest lesson, of course, is that crossing party lines to do the right thing for the country is absolutely crucial today, just as it was during World War II. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure Peter would be happy to answer questions.
Happy to take any questions.
Like President Zelensky, you too vividly evoked the 1940s. Thank you very much. I am related by marriage to the Stimson family, but I have no hidden family lore to share, so I simply agree with almost everything you said. But I would like to note that it's very interesting that the great presidents of the 19th and 20th century both excelled at assembling bipartisan cabinets. Fast forward to the 21st century, and what do we get? Norman Mineta. I feel cheated.
I would agree with that. It's interesting, the trend of making bipartisan appointments to cabinets has carried forward. Mineta was, of course, a Democrat and a former occupant of the internment camps, whom George Bush the first appointed. President Obama brought forward George Bush II's Secretary of War, Robert Gates, for example, Secretary of Defense, excuse me. But really, in recent years, these kind of appointments have really become attenuated. They don't carry the same weight that you see in the relationship between Stimson and FDR. However, I do believe that they still can have tremendous importance for sending a message of collaboration. And it's fascinating to think that President Biden has made no bipartisan cabinet appointments, even though he is a great admirer of FDR, and even though he sends a message of supporting bipartisanship very vigorously. I personally think that President Biden is actually deploying an FDR-like strategy. He's waiting for the right moment to make those appointments. And I think that if President Trump is the nominee of the Republican Party for the race in 2024, you may find that he may appoint Republicans to his cabinet to ensure that crossover Republican support occurs. But that's all speculation, obviously. I have no inside information. Any other questions?
I just have a question about the Stimson diaries, which obviously really revealed such a contemporaneous analysis of what was going on in Stimson intrapersonally as well as, interpersonally. So I was wondering whether or not that book would have been possible without that wealth of information.
Yes, the question there is about the Stimson diaries, and which are housed at Yale, Stimson's alma mater, and about 10,000 pages of diaries. He kept them religiously from, I think, the early 1900s, and he would write entries sometimes as long as 6 pages every day. They're one of the most respected sources of contemporaneous accounts of events during the war, and they provide a tremendous insight to what was going on in this relationship. So I think the answer to the question is it certainly would have been much harder to write this story without those diaries. I lived for 4 years with those diaries, and I love reading them. They're fascinating, and if you're looking for some side reading, I go down to Yale and take a look at them. I wish they were published. They are not published on their own. In fact, they're not even available digitally. You can get them on microfilm, which is what I did. But it's a remarkable document. Any other questions? Yeah.
We have some online. Alan is asking, do you see any similarities in the Lend-Lease program and our current aid to Ukraine?
Certainly there's a similarity between Lend-Lease and American support for Ukraine. It's a critical stand to defend democracy from fascism. I don't have any problem saying what we have in Russia is fascism to this day, and I think the parallel is very clear. One thing that's interesting there is that President Biden was able to assemble U.S. support and international support for the Ukrainian government to defend itself and defend its people very quickly. It seemed that it happened in a matter of weeks. That is because the internationalist defense of democracy that Stimson and Roosevelt made the basis of American policy prepared the field. Americans are now so used to thinking, oh yes, we need to support democracy, we need to fight back where there is an invasion against democracy. That made it possible for American support for Ukraine to happen so quickly. Contrast that with the huge battle over Lend-Lease and isolationism in 1939, 1940, and 41. So yes, but there is a parallel for sure. Yes.
Thank you. I'm just thinking about historical instances of defending democracy abroad being taken too far, perhaps. Like, I would say the coup in Guatemala was the CIA's attempt to defend American values abroad, perhaps. And I'm wondering if you can comment on the partisan environment in that instance or others, or if you think there's any relationship there.
Well, that's a very interesting question. The coup in Guatemala, I mean, when you speak of overreach in support of democracy, it's a huge problem. And I think that the other ones I'd add to the list are Vietnam, and though it's not exactly analogous, the Iraq War, where you can't just support everything, or when you want to do things, you can't say, oh, we're saving democracy, therefore we're going to do whatever we want to do. And the coup in Guatemala had very limited involvement from Congress. It was purely a CIA operation, and there was no democratic movement. But there's no involvement of Congress, and there wasn't a case where the two parties came together to support that. So there are different cases, but in Vietnam, for example, both parties supported military action at different stages of the war, until they didn't. So I do think that, I'm not saying that in all cases, everything that an American policymaker says must be done in the name of spreading democracy is the right thing. So that's an important caveat. Any other questions?
I want to thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and we have books available in the lobby, and I hope that people online will be able to purchase copies through their favorite online retailer. So thank you very much.